usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this baseline expectation of precision. It's almost like engineering in a way.
Right. Yeah. It's binary. It's objective reality just staring you in the face.
Exactly. I mean, you break your arm, you go into the clinic, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points a pen at it and says, there it is, that's the fracture.
Broken or not broken, it's clean.
Right. But then you step out of the hospital and into the world of sociology, cultural shifts, institutional changes, and suddenly that x-ray machine is fundamentally broken.
Oh, completely. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
Very murky, especially today when we're talking about the shifting, seemingly hostile redefinitions of masculinity. I actually want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a second.
Yeah, this is important context.
Because if you're tuning into this, there's a very high probability that you're part of a growing demographic, particularly within the men's rights and broader manosphere communities.
Right, people who share a very specific, very palpable feeling right now.
Yes, exactly. It's this pervasive, almost suffocating sense that modern institutions, whether we're talking about the public school system, mainstream media, corporate HR departments, or the legal system itself, have been fundamentally surgically altered.
Altered specifically to suppress masculine energy and traditional values.
Right. And you're tuning in because you want to understand the history of our institutions before they were captured by what many in these circles identify as, feminist and Marxist ideologies. You want to see the fracture on the x-ray.
Which is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters, honestly. But today, we are looking at a text that claims to have built a brand new high-resolution x-ray machine.
Yeah, to see exactly what happened to that institutional landscape and, more importantly, how the fracture was made.
That is the mission today.
So we're reviewing a highly provocative, deeply polarizing new ebook today. It claims to have the exact blueprint for this institutional capture.
And we are going to impartially unpack the core arguments, the historical claims, and the biological theories presented in it.
The book is Conrad Reicher's aggressive 2025 manifesto. It's titled Leftwaffe Lie Blitzkrieg: Repressive Tolerance, Cancellation, Feminized Woke Authoritarian, Totalizing Postmodernist Marxist Female Supremacists.
It is a mouthful of a title, and he does not hold back.
No, he doesn't. Okay. Now, before we put on our intellectual hazmat suits and wade into this, look, given the highly charged, unapologetically anti-feminist and anti-Marxist nature of this text, we need to be very clear about how we're handling this.
Yes, absolutely. Our goal today is not to endorse or take sides on Reicher's worldview. We are not here to validate or condemn the politics of the left or the right.
Right, our job is strictly forensic.
Think of us as the technicians operating that x-ray machine. We're going to impartially examine his arguments, decode the highly specific terminology he uses, and genuinely understand the framework he presents to his readers.
Yeah, if his arguments hold structural weight, we'll point it out. If they rely on rhetorical sleight of hand, we'll dissect that too. We are the guides, not the judges.
Exactly.
And hey, quick favor before we plunge down this rabbit hole. Please take a second to like and subscribe to the show. It genuinely helps us out.
It really does.
Also, we are reviewing this ebook in extreme depth today. And if this breakdown resonates with you, if it hooks you and sparks your curiosity to see the full unvarnished argument, you can buy the ebook right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Which I suspect it will for a lot of you.
Yeah. And you can also follow the author for more of his direct red-pilled insights at Conrad Reicher on Substack. That's at ConradNriker on Substack.
So if we're going to look at the modern symptoms, the corporate HR policies, the campus protests, the media narratives, we really have to start by looking at the philosophical disease that Reicher diagnoses.
Because his core question isn't just that the rules of the game changed, but how they changed so incredibly quickly without a literal shot being fired.
Right. He uses this term, the Leftwaffe Blitzkrieg.
Yeah, he argues that the rapid assault on language and institutions isn't some accidental downstream effect of social media, right?
No, he claims it is a deliberate, highly engineered tactic. It's designed to bypass logic with manufactured emotional outrage.
But I want to trace the lineage here. Where does he say this actually started? Because he goes way further back than, 2014 Tumblr or 2020 Twitter.
Oh, way back. He traces it directly back to the Frankfurt School, and specifically to a philosopher named Herbert Marcuse.
Okay, the context here is crucial to understand Reicher's entire framework, I think.
It is. The Frankfurt School was a group of Marxist intellectuals who, according to Reicher, had a massive realization in the mid-20th century.
Right, they realized that traditional economic Marxism, the whole proletariat rising up to seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie, had fundamentally failed in the West.
Because the Western working class was actually doing pretty well.
Yeah, they didn't want a violent revolution, they wanted stable jobs, a mortgage, a family.
Exactly. They were too comfortable to revolt. So, Riker argues, these intellectuals pivoted.
If you can't conquer the economy from the bottom up, you conquer the culture from the top down.
Right. They pivoted to cultural Marxism. The strategy became, well, to achieve the revolution, you have to rot the culture from the inside out.
By systematically dismantling the pillars of Western civilization, the nuclear family, traditional religion, and the very concept of objective truth.
Yes, and I had to read the section on Marcuse 3 times before it fully clicked.
Me too. Because Riker points to Marcuse's 1965 essay titled Repressive Tolerance as the master key to this whole operation.
But the concept sounds like pure doublespeak at first glance.
It really does. Marcuse essentially argued that to achieve true tolerance and liberation, society must suppress right-wing movements while tolerating left-wing ones.
It is doublespeak. It's a paradox, and that's precisely why Riker highlights it. Riker views repressive tolerance as a totalitarian coup wrapped in a velvet, empathetic-sounding word.
It creates a psychological framework where the left can seamlessly weaponize victimhood. Let's walk through the mechanics of that, actually, because this is where the genius of the trap really lies.
Go for it.
By claiming that conservative or traditional ideas, like, say, the necessity of a strong father figure, are inherently violent or oppressive, they justify silencing that dissent.
And they do it not under the banner of censorship, but under the banner of protecting people.
Exactly. Disagreement is no longer categorized as a difference of opinion. It is framed as a literal physical threat to safety.
And once you establish that semantic rule, well, you own the game.
You really do.
You don't have to debate the merits of traditional masculinity. You just declare that the presence of traditional masculinity makes people unsafe, and therefore it must be eradicated.
It's a brilliant, insidious mechanism for institutional capture, but Riker goes even further back. He points the finger at Theodor Adorno, another Frankfurt School figure, and his book, The Authoritarian Personality.
And this is where it gets really dark regarding the specific war on men.
Yeah, Riker says Adorno and his colleagues developed the F-scale to measure fascist tendencies in the population.
Yes, and look at what Adorno actually put on that scale. Look at the traits he identified as latent fascism.
This blew my mind. Riker claims this was basically a pseudoscientific smear campaign.
He does. He says Adorno took baseline, traditional masculine traits, things like stoicism, discipline, the desire for a strong father figure, respect for hierarchy, loyalty to one's own in-group, and literally pathologized them.
He categorized them as mental disorders that lead to fascism.
Right. Riker argues this is the psychological artillery barrage required before the infantry can move in.
If you want to conquer a society, you have to neutralize its defenders.
Exactly. By redefining masculine virtue as a sickness, you make men doubt their own nature. You convince the sheepdog that his teeth and his instinct to guard the flock are actually proof that he's a rabid monster.
Wow. And you clear the way for what Riker calls the feminized weakling to take power.
That's his argument.
Okay, I have to push back here. Let me test this logic for a second. Let's assume Riker is dead right about the intent. Let's assume Adorno and Marcuse literally sat in a smoky room and planned this.
Okay.
If their arguments are so logically flawed, if repressive tolerance is such an obvious, glaring paradox, how on earth do they win debates in the real world?
That's a great question.
Like, how did they manage to capture the universities and the HR departments if the underlying logic is this weak?
Because they refuse to fight on logical grounds. Riker maps out their exact tactic for this, identifying their use of the Motte-Bailey doctrine.
Right. Now, a lot of people throw this term around online, but I want us to explain the actual medieval architecture this is based on.
It perfectly maps to Riker's argument of how these ideologies operate.
Yeah, break it down.
So, a Motte-Bailey is an early form of a medieval castle. The motte is a raised earthwork mound with a highly fortified defensible tower on top.
It's safe, but you can't really live or farm up there.
Right. The bailey is the enclosed courtyard down below. It's expansive, it's where all the economic activity and daily life happens, but it's much harder to defend from an attacking army.
So, how does this apply to the cultural argument?
In a debate, the bailey represents the radical, indefensible position. For example, the claim that all men are inherent oppressors, that the nuclear family must be abolished, or that meritocracy is a racist myth.
Okay, that is the Bailey. It's radical, it changes society, but it's logically very weak.
Yes. When someone like Riker attacks that radical idea with logic and statistics, the ideologue doesn't stay in the Bailey to fight. They immediately retreat up the hill to the Mont.
The Mott being the highly defensible, incredibly reasonable sounding position.
Exactly. They retreat to the Mont and say, "Whoa, why are you attacking us? We just want equality of opportunity. We just want basic human decency and kindness. Don't you believe in kindness?"
It's a semantic bait and switch. They accuse you of attacking the Mott of kindness when you are actually attacking the Bailey of radical wealth confiscation and misandry.
And as soon as the pressure's off, as soon as the attacker gives up and walks away in frustration, they stream right back down into the Bailey and start enforcing their radical policies again.
Precisely. And to counter this specific tactic, Riker proposes a very old, very potent weapon, the trivium.
This is the classical education model consisting of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. He argues that this is the only way to breach the Mott.
Let's break those down because he applies them as literal weapons in this culture war. First is grammar. For Riker, this isn't about dangling participles.
No, it means defining terms correctly and absolutely refusing to accept the left's semantic drift.
He uses the example of the term herstory. He calls it an embarrassing display of etymological illiteracy.
Which is funny, but true.
Yeah, pointing out that the word history comes from the Greek historia, meaning inquiry. It has nothing to do with the English pronouns his or story.
By demanding grammatical accuracy, you expose the absurdity of their claims and refuse to cede linguistic territory.
Then there is logic. This is the ability to identify fallacies in real time.
Right, when an HR representative or a campus activist calls you a misogynist, instead of addressing the actual data you just presented, you use logic to identify that as an ad hominem attack.
You don't get defensive. You coldly point out that they have effectively forfeited the debate because they abandoned reason to throw an emotional tantrum.
And finally, rhetoric, which, in Riker's framework, translates to destroying the narrative with mockery.
He argues that the radical left lacks the masculine capacity for risk and self-deprecation, which is why there's that old internet adage, the left can't meme.
He believes humor and mockery are the swords of the free mind.
A well-crafted meme or a mocking joke can bypass all their academic defenses. It destroys their totalitarian seriousness faster than a 40-page essay ever could.
Which brings us to a critical juncture in Riker's thesis. If the ideological framework of the left is built entirely on semantics, linguistic tricks, and emotional manipulation.
What happens when that ideology collides with hard, undeniable science?
Right, if they're overriding culture, what about biology? We are moving from the philosophical blueprint to human biology now.
And Riker comes out swinging here. He argues that nature is a cruel mistress, but never a liar.
He asserts that the entire feminist project, the entire attempt to neutralize masculinity, relies completely on the blank slate theory.
Okay, the blank slate theory is the idea that human beings are born as identical, malleable lumps of clay.
That the male brain and the female brain are indistinguishable at birth.
And that gender is purely a social construct shaped by how your parents dress you and what toys society hands you.
And Riker claims this is not just wrong, it is aggressively debunked by modern neuroscience. He doesn't just cite evolutionary psychology.
He cites advanced MRI imaging studies from institutions like Cambridge University.
Right. They map profound sexual dimorphism, meaning literal physical and structural differences based on sex in the human brain.
He specifically looks at the amygdala, the limbic system, and the corpus callosum.
Riker uses this neurological data to argue that the male brain is structurally optimized for systemizing.
For compartmentalized logic and for mechanical understanding.
Yes. In his view, this biological reality, this drive to build, order, and conquer the physical environment, is the exact engine that built Western civilization.
And he contrasts that with the female brain, which he says leans heavily toward emotional reasoning, empathy, and social cohesion.
And he explains the evolutionary why behind this.
He argues that women are evolutionarily wired to seek conformity and consensus. Because historically, deviation from the tribe meant isolation, which meant literal death for a woman and her children.
Men, conversely, are the biological agents of risk, autonomy, and boundary pushing.
To cement this, he brings in the anthropological data of Donald Brown and Steven Pinker on human universals.
Brown looked across hundreds of radically different cultures throughout history, cultures that had absolutely zero contact with one another.
And what did he find?
He found traits and social structures that exist everywhere, regardless of geography, climate, or time period.
And chief among those universals are the roles of men as predominantly hunters, risk-takers, and physical protectors.
And women as primary nurturers and social harmonizers.
Riker uses this to drop a hammer on the sociological narrative. He says this proves that these gender roles are not some grand patriarchal conspiracy invented by a secret cabal of men in top hats trying to oppress women.
They're evolutionary constants. As he puts it, to argue that patriarchy is a cultural invention is like arguing that breathing oxygen is a social construct.
But this is where I would imagine you, as the listener, would have a massive question. If these traits are so deeply biologically hardwired into our very DNA, how does Riker explain the modern attempt to force men to abandon them?
Yeah, if you can't socialize away biology, how are they supposedly pulling this off?
I'm glad we're bringing that up because I was literally just looking at my notes on the Minnesota starvation experiment.
Oh, that is a fascinating connection he makes.
I know Ansel Keys starved guys of calories during World War II to study the physiological effects of famine, but Riker maps that onto modern culture, claiming society is starving men of purpose.
And initially I thought, isn't that a huge logical leap? How do you connect literal caloric starvation to cultural apathy?
It's a leap, but Riker builds a really fascinating mechanical bridge between the two.
In the Keys experiment, they took healthy, dominant, highly competitive young men and systematically starved them. What happened?
It wasn't just physical atrophy, the psychological effects were profound. They became completely apathetic.
They lost their sex drive entirely, they stopped caring about politics, broader ideas, or personal ambitions.
Instead, they became hyperfixated on mundane, trivial, safe tasks like collecting recipes.
So Riker is using this as a neurological analogy.
Yeah.
He claims the modern system is deliberately attempting to starve male vitality.
But instead of withholding bread, society is withholding purpose. It is withholding arenas for natural, testosterone-driven competition.
And it is withholding societal respect. And Riker argues the neurochemical cascade is identical.
When you starve a man of his evolutionary mandate to conquer and provide, you get docile, sexless, apathetic men. Men who are easily managed as compliant cogs in an HR-driven machine.
It is a dark extrapolation, but it perfectly illustrates his point about the suppression of nature creating a neurosis.
When you try to house a wolf in a sheep's pen, you shouldn't be surprised when the wolf either tears the pen apart in frustration,
Or conversely, when its spirit breaks and it just curls up and dies.
to really drive this psychological suppression home, he brings in Esther Vilar's controversial book, The Manipulated Man.
Now, for the manosphere audience listening, you already know Vilar is a foundational red pill text.
But Riker applies her specifically to this idea of institutional capture.
Vilar's core premise, which Riker wholly adopts, is that modern society actively, aggressively gaslights men.
She argues that women have evolved to be superior manipulators of what she calls the hero instinct.
The innate biological drive men have to protect, provide, and sacrifice themselves for women and children.
Right. Vilar and Riker argue that this noble drive has been systematically weaponized into a tool for male enslavement.
Society convinces men that parasitic resource extraction by women, whether that's in predatory divorce courts, fundamentally one-sided relationships, or even the tax code, is actually proof of love.
Or evidence of male privilege. The man is shamed as a misogynist for recognizing the transactional nature of the setup.
While the extraction itself is celebrated by the media as female empowerment.
It is basically framing the entire modern social contract between men and women as a psychological trap that feeds off the male instinct to self-immolate for the tribe.
So if these traits are biological, and the suppression is this totalizing, it can't just start when a guy gets his first corporate job. It has to start early.
Which brings us to where Riker points the finger next, the public education system.
Riker's critique of the modern education system is absolutely savage. He argues that the classroom has been fundamentally inverted from its historical purpose.
Let's compare the two models he presents, because he says that in 1900, the classroom was a masculine forge.
It was built around the trivium. It was about raw knowledge transfer, grammar, rigorous logic, and highly competitive, often combative debate.
It rewarded merit and intellectual aggression.
Yes. And today, he argues, it has been transformed into a matriarchal hellscape.
He points to the obsession with social emotional learning as a curriculum designed specifically to scrub boyhood out of boys.
He cites Dr. Leonard Sax's book, Boys Adrift, to build a very rigid syllogism here. Let me lay it out, because the mechanics of this are vital.
Please do.
Premise A, young males have naturally high kinetic energy levels, an evolutionary drive for physical dominance, and a learning style that relies on action and risk.
And premise B, Modern schools demand sedentary compliance, sitting perfectly still in a circle, verbal agreeableness, and they penalize any form of physical roughhousing.
The conclusion being that the modern educational system inherently, by its very design, pathologizes male vitality.
Exactly. Riker doesn't look at the massive exponential explosion of ADHD diagnoses in young boys over the last 30 years as a sudden, tragic medical crisis.
He frames it as chemical castration.
He argues the system is literally drugging boys with amphetamines into a state of docile submission.
Because their natural kinetic masculine learning style disrupts the hyper-feminized, consensus-driven environment of the modern classroom.
And this pathologization doesn't stop in elementary school. It scales all the way up through the university system.
To prove that higher education is entirely captured by this anti-logic ideology, Riker leans heavily on the grievance studies hoax of 2018.
Now, I know our audience is very familiar with James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and Helen Kluckrose. We all know the story.
They wrote fake, absurd papers using postmodern jargon and got them published in respected journals.
But I want to focus on Riker's specific takeaway from this, because he reframes it from a funny academic prank into a terrifying symptom of civilizational collapse.
Right. The most damning of those fake papers was the one where they took a chapter of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, rewrote it by replacing terms like Jew with men and Germany with feminism.
And a leading academic journal enthusiastically published it.
Yes. Riker uses this as undeniable empirical proof that the academic system has utterly abandoned the trivium.
They no longer possess the mechanisms to value logical truth. They only value ideological compliance.
If a paper echoes their misandric, grievance-based ideology, they will print it, even if the underlying logic is literal Nazi propaganda repurposed.
It proves that the experts gatekeeping our institutions are intellectually bankrupt.
This connects directly back to Marcuse's repressive tolerance. When you abandon the trivium, when you abandon logic, grammar, and objective truth in favor of subjective feelings and lived experience, you inevitably end up with mob rule.
Because if there is no objective truth to appeal to, the only thing left is power and volume.
Which she vividly illustrates with the Evergreen State College riots.
Yes, the incident with evolutionary biology professor Brett Weinstein.
Weinstein, a man of empirical science, refused to leave his own campus during a day of absence where white people were explicitly asked to leave.
He argued, quite logically, that judging people and restricting their movement based on their race was fundamentally regressive and wrong.
And what was the result? It wasn't a debate in the town square.
No, it was a primal display of mob violence. A mob of students took over the campus, screamed obscenities at him, roamed the halls with baseball bats.
And the college administration completely caved, eventually forcing Weinstein to resign.
Riker points to this and says, look closely at the X-ray. This is what happens when feelings trump facts.
You don't get a tolerant utopia. You get a feral mob policing biological science through sheer terror.
So let's trace the life cycle of a modern man in this system. You have boys who are chemically subdued for acting like boys in primary school.
They are then ideologically trained in universities that explicitly reject objective truth and punish masculine logic.
And then, they graduate, they enter the real world. How does Riker map this ideological capture onto the economy and the courts?
Well, he argues that the modern economic and legal systems actively suppress male excellence and explicitly reward credentialism over actual physical competence.
Let's start with the economic analysis, because Riker takes an absolute sledgehammer to the mainstream wage gap narrative.
He relabels it the choice gap.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He argues that when economists actually control for the relevant variables hours worked per week, continuous, uninterrupted time in the workforce, willingness to commute, and most importantly, career choice, the 77 cents on the dollar gap mathematically vanishes.
He points out that men dominate the most dangerous, physically demanding, and unpleasant professions. Logging, roofing, deep-sea commercial fishing, sanitation.
Why? Because men are biologically wired to exchange physical hazard and extreme discomfort for high status and maximum resources to provide for their families.
And this ties directly into what he calls the safety gap, or the disposable sex theory.
This is a crucial foundational point for his readers. He points out the statistical reality.
Men make up over 90% of all workplace fatalities. They make up roughly 70% of the unsheltered homeless population.
They account for the vast majority of suicides. They are the ones who die in combat trenches.
And here is Riker's logical challenge to the progressive establishment.
If the patriarchy exists solely as an oppressive club of male privilege designed for the benefit of men, Why are men the ones dying in the mines, freezing on the streets, and blowing their brains out?
What looks like privilege at the absolute apex of society, the male CEOs and politicians, is actually the result of a high-risk, high-variance biological strategy.
Where the vast majority of average men simply serve as the disposable beasts of burden for society.
To make this abstract economic theory real, he tells the anecdote of Marcus the plumber.
It's a really powerful contrast. Marcus is a young man who looks at the university system, realizes it's captured, and decides to bypass what Riker calls an $80,000 indoctrination scam.
While his peers are going into massive, crippling debt to get degrees in what Riker mockingly calls resentment studies, Marcus learns a tangible trade.
He embraces manual labor and physical reality.
Right. And by doing so, he achieves actual financial sovereignty by age 22. He buys a house, starts a business, and operates completely outside the HR bureaucracy.
Riker uses Marcus to highlight the cultural stigma against manual labor. He views this stigma as a deliberate, elitist attempt to shame the very physical, masculine competence that built and maintains the entire infrastructure of the civilized world.
That is the economic side, a rigged game of credentialism. But the legal landscape he describes is even more perilous for young men.
He looks forensically at Title IX, specifically focusing on the Obama administration's 2011 Dear Colleague letter.
This was the federal mandate that radically changed how universities handle sexual assault allegations on campus.
Yes, and Riker claims this document systematically destroyed due process for young men.
It mandated that universities lower the standard of proof from the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt to a mere preponderance of the evidence.
Meaning, a university tribunal, often made up of ideologically driven administrators, only needs to be 50.1% sure an assault happened to ruin a young man's life and expel him.
It stripped men of the right to legal counsel in these hearings, stripped them of the right to cross-examine their accusers, and basically institutionalized Misabiri.
Riker calls it a return to the Star Chamber.
And he cites the infamous Duke Lacrosse case as the ultimate terrifying template for how this machinery operates.
3 innocent young men had their lives, their reputations, and their futures completely shattered by a provably false accusation.
But the crucial detail for Riker isn't just that a false accusation happened, it's how the entire institutional apparatus reacted to it.
The prosecutor actively hid exculpatory DNA evidence because he wanted to appease a specific voting demographic.
The media rushed to brand the boys as monsters, and the university faculty eagerly convicted them in the court of public opinion before a single fact was verified.
Riker views this as the system happily, eagerly sacrificing innocent young men on the altar of female victimhood simply to signal their own political virtue.
The truth didn't matter. The narrative did.
I want to synthesize this with an analogy that I think perfectly summarizes Riker's view of society's deep hypocrisy regarding men.
Okay, what is it?
It's like this. Society demands the absolute safety and pristine lawns of the gated community, but it actively despises, spits on, and pathologizes the masculine, heavily armed guard standing at the gate.
That is exactly the mechanism of his argument. Society wants the physical safety, the functioning power grids, the sewage systems, and the infrastructure that male aggression and physical competence provide.
But it simultaneously pathologizes the very neurochemical traits required to provide them.
He points to the infamous Gillette ad backlash as the ultimate corporate proof of this.
Oh man, remember the toxic masculinity commercial?
Yep. Gillette, a company that sells razors to men, decided to lecture its core male consumer base on their innate flaws and supposed inherent toxicity. As a result, it cost them billions in lost market value. To Riker, this proves that woke capital is totally disconnected from reality. They fundamentally misunderstand their male consumer base,
Assuming men will just politely pay money to be insulted by a razor company.
which naturally raises a massive overarching question. Riker doesn't just see this as a quirky modern phenomenon caused by diversity consultants and social media algorithms.
He views this dynamic, the suppression of masculinity and the elevation of matriarchal feeling over logical truth, as a cyclical, fatal, historical disease.
Yes, which leads us to the most sweeping part of the book, historical echoes of collapse.
Riker looks deep into history to claim that whenever a civilization abandons its masculine, logical, boundary-enforcing roots for a matriarchal, emotion-based, highly permissive structure, it doesn't just stagnate.
It falls hard.
To support this macro-historical view, he leans heavily on the work of J.D. Unwin.
An anthropologist who wrote a somewhat forgotten but incredibly dense book called Sex and Culture in 1934.
I've heard Unwin referenced in passing, but Riker really unpacks the mechanics of his findings. What exactly did Unwin study, and what was the mechanism he discovered?
Unwin studied 80 different civilizations over thousands of years of history, from the Babylonians to the Greeks, to the Romans, to the Anglo-Saxons.
He was looking for the variable that determined a society's rise and fall, right?
Exactly. He found a 100% correlation between strict sexual monarchism, which essentially means strict, culturally enforced patriarchy and monogamy, and high cultural energy.
Define cultural energy in this context.
According to Unwin, when a society tightly channels its innate sexual energy and restricts it strictly into the nuclear family unit, that repressed energy sublimates.
It transforms outward.
The men take that energy and they build empires, they invent calculus, they compose symphonies, they explore the stars.
The discipline required for strict monogamy translates into the discipline required to conquer the physical world.
And what happens when a society abandons that discipline? When sex is decoupled from responsibility?
When a society becomes highly permissive, promiscuous, and matriarchal.
That society inevitably collapses within 3 generations. Unwin called this the final zoological phase.
In this phase, the creative, building energy of the society is entirely spent on immediate physical pleasure, identity politics, and endless consumption rather than building or defending the borders.
Riker claims the modern West is currently deep into this terminal zoological phase.
Riker brings up some very specific historical eras to prove this cycle, and his analysis of how the transition happens is fascinating. He looks at the Severan dynasty in the later stages of the Roman Empire.
He says that the empire swapped the stoic iron discipline of the Mos Maiorum, the ancestral customs of duty and martial valor, for the capricious emotional whims of matriarchal court figures.
Like Julia Domna, the mechanism of collapse here is key.
The state stopped being a strict father figure, enforcing martial order and demanding excellence.
Instead, it became a bloated, smothering mother figure, dispensing endless welfare bread and circuses to keep the populace fat, entertained, and placated.
The borders became weak, the military was hollowed out, and the empire rotted from within long before the barbarians actually breached the gates.
He also points to the fall of ancient Athens, and specifically the execution of Socrates.
Now, usually we are taught this as a tragedy of free speech, but Riker frames it entirely through the lens of gender dynamics.
It is a profound analogy. He contrasts the masculine, heroic, high-stakes vigor of the Greeks during the Persian Wars, the men who held the line at Thermopylae,
with the later, effete, highly bureaucratic phase of Athenian democracy.
Right, the phase where endless debate and demagoguery paralyzed all decisive action. He frames the execution of Socrates as a feminized, consensus-driven mob murdering the masculine logos.
They didn't kill Socrates because he was a traitor. They killed him out of spite.
His relentless logic and questioning reminded the mob of their own mediocrity and intellectual laziness.
Riker says this is the exact same mechanism driving modern cancel culture. The mediocre, consensus-driven masses uniting to tear down the exceptional, logical individual because excellence is inherently offensive to them.
But the most chilling historical parallel he draws, and the one he spends the most time on, is the Weimar Republic in Germany, right before the rise of the Third Reich.
This is where the book gets incredibly dark. He maps Weimar almost one-to-one with the modern day.
He describes Weimar Germany as a period of extreme cultural degeneracy, the total hyperinflation not just of currency but of moral values.
The breakdown of the family and the explicit demonization of traditional German masculinity. Sound familiar?
It's the exact blueprint he claims we are living through right now with the Leftwaffe Blitzkrieg.
And here is his dire, incredibly serious warning. He notes that the madness of Weimar did not end with a gentle, polite return to centrist sanity.
The cultural Marxism and degeneracy of the time provoked a reaction from the suppressed men that was so severe, so hyper-violent, that it brought about the Nazis.
He references Carl Jung here, the psychological concept of the shadow, and this is the mechanism of the backlash.
Yes. Jung argued that if you violently suppress a natural part of the human psyche, it doesn't just disappear, you don't cure it.
It gets pushed down into the subconscious where it ferments, grows angry, and becomes a shadow.
Riker warns that if modern institutions continually suppress the biological masculine spirit with lies, HR policies, and suffocating ideology, that spirit will inevitably return.
But because it has been demonized, it won't return as a rational, stoic, chivalrous force. It will return as a feral monstrosity.
He believes the Leftwaffe is pushing the pendulum so far into unnatural territory that the inevitable swing back will be violently destructive.
Okay, so with all this apocalyptic doom and gloom laid out, with the collapse of empires and the rise of Jungian monstrosities on the horizon,
How does Riker see this actually ending for us? Because he doesn't just leave the reader in despair.
no, he offers a specific way out, a roadmap tailored specifically for the younger generation of men.
That brings us to our final act here, Generation Z's rebellion and the path forward.
The book concludes with a deep analysis of the current youth rebellion, which looks very different from the rebellions of the 1960s, and he provides literal step-by-step survival instructions.
It starts with a massive, undeniable demographic split. He cites Pew Research data from 2022. 54% of young men now identify as conservative or lean conservative.
But only 38% of their female peers do. The gap is widening every year.
That is a staggering sociological divide, and Riker completely rejects the mainstream media narrative that this is a sudden, inexplicable wave of bigotry or misogyny among young men.
He frames it as starvation.
Starving men seeking the truth.
Exactly. He argues these young men are starving for purpose, for honest recognition of their biological nature, and for rigid structure in a world that tells them everything is subjective.
Which leads us to his analysis of the phenomenon he calls the Andrew Tate matrix.
Also known as the top G.
Yeah.
Now, our audience knows who Tate is, and we know he's arguably the most controversial figure of the decade.
But Riker's analysis of why Tate became so astronomically popular is fascinating because it indicts the entire institutional system.
Riker argues that the mainstream media completely, utterly failed to villainize Tate to young men.
Why? Because while the media painted him as a cartoonish monster and a human trafficker, young men looked at Tate and saw the only public figure offering something the culture had explicitly denied them.
Self-discipline, financial sovereignty, physical fitness, unapologetic brotherhood, and a clear, rigid roadmap to traditional masculinity.
Riker points out that the aggressive censorship campaign against the manosphere banning figures like Roosh V, nuking subreddits, shadow banning accounts on TikTok and Instagram didn't actually silence the message.
It resulted in a massive civilization-level Streisand effect.
Right. By trying so desperately to hide the truth, the institutional censors inadvertently signaled to young men that the information was highly valuable.
If the system you hate is trying to ban a book, you instantly want to read that book.
It drove millions of young men down the rabbit hole, away from highly policed algorithms and onto unfiltered, decentralized platforms like Rumble X and Telegram.
Spaces where the conversation is raw, masculine, and the legacy media gatekeepers have absolutely zero control over the narrative.
But Riker's solutions aren't just about consuming digital content. He looks at physical and economic rebellions as well.
For example, he highlights the explosive worldwide rise of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
He notes a 400% growth in BJJ participation since 2012.
He views the BJJ mat as a sacred sanctuary for modern men. It is a purely meritocratic, violently honest physical space where the laws of physics absolutely trump the laws of political correctness.
On the mat, your gender studies degree is worthless. There are no diversity quotas.
You either understand leverage and technique, or you get choked unconscious.
Riker says it is one of the last spaces where men can reclaim their biological imperative to be physically dangerous but totally disciplined.
He also talks about a quieter, arguably more dangerous rebellion on the economic front, the herbivore men.
This is a term borrowed from Japan, describing a growing cohort of men who simply refuse to date, refuse to marry, and refuse to strive for high corporate status.
Riker frames this not as depression, but as a highly rational economic strike.
A men's strike against a rigged market. Riker's logic is brutal here.
If the cost of entry to the modern economy is the surrender of your dignity to HR departments, the constant threat of false accusations, predatory divorce courts that will strip you of your assets and children,
and funding a tax system that actively hates you, then the only winning move is not to play.
you downshift, you work just enough to support your own hobbies, and you starve the beast of your excess labor.
So, given all of this, what is his final advice? What does he tell his red-pilled readers to actually do with their lives?
He outlines a strict action plan he calls the Praxa.
Step 1 of the Praxa, ghost the gynocentric system.
Withdraw your labor, your attention, and your loyalty. Stop seeking validation, approval, or intimacy from a culture that views your very biological existence as a pathology to be cured.
Step 2, build parallel institutions.
To explain how to do this, he draws inspiration from the Dark Ages. specifically the Christian monastic orders.
When the Roman Empire was collapsing into hedonism, weakness, and eventual ruin, brotherhoods of men didn't stay in the cities to fight a losing political battle.
They retreated. They built remote monasteries.
They aggressively preserved the classical texts, they maintained the trivium, they practiced strict discipline, and they literally kept the flame of Western civilization alive through the darkness.
Riker says modern men need to adopt this exact monastic mindset. Stop trying to reform the public university, it's dead.
Build digital fortresses, local debate clubs, unwoke gyms, and private fraternal organizations.
Insulate yourselves from the algorithmic mob and become highly competent, self-reliant nodes of resistance.
And finally, he offers a specific tactical weapon for engaging with the mainstream when you absolutely have to. The rhetorical judo of just asking questions.
He points to Jordan Peterson as the absolute grandmaster of this tactic.
Yes. In a culture governed by repressive tolerance, a culture that weaponizes victimhood, you cannot make declarative statements that the left can lazily label as hate speech.
Instead, you use the Socratic method. You ask polite, surgical questions that expose the glaring logical contradictions of the feminist narrative.
Like, if we truly believe in tearing down gender barriers, why are there no campaigns to get women into deep-sea welding?
Or, if society privileges men, why do we ignore the male suicide rate?
It is brilliant because it forces the opposition to either confront their own logical failures in public or throw a tantrum.
But it denies them the ability to play the victim card.
Yeah.
Because you merely asked a question. It's a fascinating, highly effective rhetorical strategy.
It is a complete blueprint for intellectual insurgency.
Which brings us to the end of our incredibly deep dive into Conrad Reicher's Leftwaffe Lie Blitzkrieg.
We've traced the philosophical roots of institutional capture from the Frankfurt School and Marcuse, explored the hard biological realities of sexual dimorphism that shatter the blank slate,
Looked at how the educational and economic systems chemically and legally suppress men.
reviewed the chilling historical parallels from Unwin to Weimar, and finally, outlined Reicher's radical monastic path forward for Gen Z men.
It is an incredibly dense, provocative, and highly structured argument. Whether it infuriates you or validates everything you've suspected, it is a framework that demands to be wrestled with.
Absolutely, and as we promised, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. It's something inspired by the text, but pushes the boundaries of Reicher's conclusion just a bit further.
If Reicher is right, if millions of capable, intelligent men are beginning a widespread logical strike against traditional participation in the economy and relationships,
If they are actively withdrawing their genius and muscle to build these monastic parallel structures, what happens to the mainstream society they leave behind?
does the system realize the engine is sputtering, panic, and attempt to self-correct?
Or does it double down, completely blind to its own decay, and accelerate straight into the historical collapse that Reicher predicts?
A society that actively alienates its builders and its protectors is a society walking a very fragile tightrope over a very deep abyss.
Something serious to think about. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly intense journey. Remember to like, subscribe, and share this deep dive with anyone, any young man, any father, any thinker who needs to hear it.
And again, do not just take our word for it. To fully understand the mechanisms we discussed, you need to read the unabridged, raw arguments for yourself.
We heavily encourage you to buy Leftwaffe Lie Blitzkrieg by Conrad Reicher. It is available right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
You can also get more unfiltered, red-pilled insights directly from the source by following @ConradReicher on Substack.
Until next time, keep questioning the narrative.
Keep your X-ray machine calibrated, gentlemen.
The diagnostic landscape might be intentionally murky, but the underlying structures, the biology, the history, the logic, are always there if you know where to look. Take care, everyone.